What's up, everyone? Well, today I am going to do a little bit of work with these bare root Chinese elm seedlings. Now, if you're not familiar with Chinese elm, there are a number of videos on this channel, one of which is about this tiny little one, and then there's a large Chinese elm, and these are the regular wild type Chinese elms rather than cuttings from cork bark Chinese elms. So they have kind of a smooth bark. It has plates on it that can fall off and makes interesting puzzle-like characteristics in the bark of the mature trees. So this was actually a cutting off of a much larger tree that I then turned into a mame tree. But these are actually seedlings, so we're going to be working mostly with those. When we're talking about bare root, we're really talking about mostly bare root, and the roots still have some soil in them. Basically, they're just not in containers. So when you get them, they're probably going to look either a little bit like this, or in the case of Zelkovas, well, this has some soil in it. Occasionally, you might get them and they have even less soil than this. In terms of caring for bare root trees until spring, because I'm making this video in winter, and you really only would ship bare root plants to other people during the dormant period for those plants, I'm just going to kind of comb out these roots a little bit because I'm in the habit of doing that every time I touch a plant that has roots exposed. But bottom line is that when you get the pack, you don't actually immediately have to do anything with it. You can leave this in that plastic bag, maybe add a little bit of sphagnum moss or soil around it, and just leave that in your refrigerator. So if you look closely, these are actually starting to leaf out, and that's because here in the San Francisco Bay Area, the winters are not particularly cold, and in fact, some of the mature Chinese elms that we have don't even really drop all of their leaves. If we want them to be bare, we have to go in and remove the leaves in some cases. So you can leave them in your refrigerator for a while until it starts to warm up and then pot them up. And that's probably the least amount of work immediately, but don't forget, and you're also going to want to make sure that the roots don't actually dry out. So you see there's a fair amount of moisture in the bag, and it'll stay that way because the trees themselves are not actually absorbing water from the soil right now because they're largely dormant. But your refrigerator might be on the dry side, and so the tops can handle that with no problem, but you want to make sure that the roots don't dry out. The second option would be to just literally plunk them into a container with some soil around it, like this. Now, granted, I did kind of comb out the roots and trim them just in case I don't get back to these. But what I'm talking about basically is to essentially put them into a container like this. With soil around them, just like you would if you were repotting trees. Now, in this case, I've kind of made a clump out of that bunch of bare root. And if you want to make clump style compositions, starting with bare root trees is really one of the best ways to do it because the roots are already intertwined and they're not going to easily separate, at least most of the time. So if I wanted to put a little movement in these, I could either wire them now or wait until later in the spring when they're actively growing. Generally, with deciduous trees, wiring during the active growing period is a little bit safer than wiring during dormancy. The twigs tend to be a little bit more brittle during the dormancy periods. Now, once you put it into a container like this, if you are in a cold climate, you're going to want to keep it somewhere that's protected from freezing temperatures. Maybe that's an unheated garage or a cold frame or something like that, but we really don't. Once the trees have been transplanted, they're a little bit more vulnerable to freezing, and we really don't want to let this freeze solid. So a little bit of light protection, and even if that means that the trees get less sunlight for that period of time until you're ready to actually sit them outside, that's okay. We just want to make sure that they don't die from overly cold conditions. Set this aside and grab another bunch. All right, and now with using the same technique that I use sometime in Zelkova compositions, Zelkova and Chinese Elm being reasonably closely related, not the same genus, but the same family of plants and very similar growing habits in terms of the leaf patterns and whatnot. I've basically taken one wire, wrapped it around the base of the clump of 5 trees, and then I've wired up the trunks of the 2 larger ones, kind of squeezing the 3 little ones in between. Now, this is a technique that I use in terms of creating forest compositions. And so if you're going to create a forest composition, usually, unless it's a very small one, I would want a lot more trees than this. And you'd probably want some that are a little bit bigger. So you could separate out one or more of the trees and grow it on in a separate container, creating complementary movement in order to allow this one to grow big while this one stays smaller. So I don't want to go for anything too crazy here in terms of movement if it's going to be in a forest composition later, because forests, by their very nature, have trees kind of packed together, and those trees will tend to grow reasonably straight, although not usually perfectly straight. So the soil mix I'm using here is a mix of mostly perlite, and I've added a little bit of fir bark and lava to it. I was previously using almost all perlite with coco coir, which I still use from time to time. But the fir bark has a longer life expectancy in the pot conditions. All right, so I've potted this one with 5 trees and this one with 1. There were actually 6 in the clump instead of 5. And I'm going to plan, if I'm going to use these in a forest, maybe along with some other trees like the ones that I did in the previous clump, I'm going to let this tree grow quite a bit, or I'm going to hope that it grows quite a bit to get a bigger trunk so we have more disparity in sizes in the composition. Meanwhile, keeping 5 trees in a single container will slow them down sort of automatically compared to the single one, and so we'll have a different sizes to use in the forest composition. All right, and now with these two, I've started to make some shapes in terms of if I wanted to make, say, like a shohin informal upright tree that was a single trunk composition with branching, then I'm going to need to put some nice bends in here. And whenever you're doing the initial bends on something like a project like that, I never count on the bends that I'm actually creating being super useful. There are probably going to be times where you're going to have to cut back largely most of those bends, or you're going to have shoots coming out from somewhere down below the majority of the wood that you've bent. But nevertheless, adding a little bit of movement like this is going to get you closer to that type of composition that you want, something that has a lot of character and taper in the trunk without just boring straight sections like you would get from cutting back a tree that was grown out without being wired. So I was sort of, as I was doing this, testing how far I could bend these, and I'll go, so using the classic bad situation here, I've got the bend of the trunk of the tree now unsupported completely by the wire because of where it's bent, and see how far I can bend it before it breaks. And as you can see, pretty dang flexible. That's like a 180-degree turn in about a half an inch. So these are probably good in terms of creating some pretty twisty compositions if you really want to. All right, so just to rehash, basically what I've done is taken 3 clumps of bare root Chinese elm seedlings and done a variety of things with them. These 2 I split into 2, took one so that it will grow faster by itself in a single pot, and left the others in a container together. These I was just sort of putting in this pot as a temporary measure to protect them until spring, which is why I didn't bother wiring them. I would hypothetically be taking them back out. And then this is another clump that I would intend to be part of a forest. And these 2 are ones that I sort of experimented with in terms of making sharp or gentle bends, the type of bending that you would want to do if you are creating informal, upright, single trunk trees and going to be growing on the trunk to be a little bit bigger than what they are right now. In terms of the forest stuff, it's largely exactly the same for Zelkova compositions. Usually Zelkovas are not grown as informal uprights. Don't ask me why. I think that they actually could make really good informal uprights, but in this case, they are not by tradition. I hope that helps you with your young elms and similar types of trees. If you want to pick up some bare root Chinese elms, we have a few left on bonsaify.com, along with some bare root Zelkovas. That's it for this time. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.